And again, I'll let you know when to start, Jake.
I jumped the gun a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. Don't worry, though. We have a few seconds before.
And I stopped, so.
And now the campaign is in a hole thanks to that, Jake.
All right, you can go ahead.
Welcome to today's telephone town hall. Tonight we'll be discussing the facts behind Measure 92 on your ballot this November. We really want to hear from you and make sure this is an interactive call. So if you have questions at any time during the event, please press 0 to ask your question. On the agenda for tonight, we have a panel of 3 folks to talk with you. First is Kevin. Kevin is a farmer from Madras. We have Ian Tollison with the Northwest Food Processors. And we have Dana Bieber, who's an advocate for the No on 92 Coalition. And again, if you have questions for us, you can press 0 to be put in line to ask your question. Now I'm going to introduce our first speaker tonight. It's Kevin Richards. Kevin is a farmer from Madras whose family grows carrot seed, grass seed, peppermint oil, alfalfa, wheat, and hay. Before farming full-time, Kevin served with the American Farm Bureau Federation. Kevin?
Hi, thanks very much for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be joining the call tonight and representing a farmer's perspective and hopefully answer some of your questions and possibly correct any misconceptions that might be out there. And then, of course, urge you to vote no on 92. From a farmer's perspective, the things that concern me most about 92 are the direct costs that we'll face, so stewardship costs in terms of labor, higher equipment expenses needed to maintain segregation and maintain the integrity of a crop. Things that might divert our crop production in order to maintain the integrity of a crop, so might change our rotation and force us to grow different crops that are less profitable. And then, of course, all of the burdensome record-keeping affidavits, legal risks associated with what's essentially an arbitrary labeling requirement. And all of those direct costs, of course, falling on small and family farmers the hardest. And then as someone that's relatively young, the indirect costs that concern me are really, you have to remember that Measure 92 is a labeling requirement that would fall only on Oregonians, and that really puts farmers here in Oregon at a pretty significant competitive disadvantage in terms of what sort of crops we can grow and export and market outside of the state. And then also discouraging research and innovation and technology that can benefit the future of agriculture and make agriculture more sustainable, more productive going forward. So, both the direct costs and indirect costs worry me, and I think it's really important that you join us in voting no on 92.
Thanks, Kevin. And again, if you've just joined us, this is a telephone town hall on Measure 92. Ballots are in your hand or maybe sitting on your kitchen table. There's a lot of information out there. And this is your opportunity to get the facts and ask a question that's relevant for how you're going to fill out your ballot. If you do want to ask a question, you can press 0 at any time. Now I want to go ahead and introduce our second guest. Our second guest tonight is Ian Tollison. Ian is with the Northwest Food Processors Association. He represents small and large food producers on issues relating to labeling, regulation, and food cost. Ian, would you go ahead?
Yeah, hi, good evening. Thank you all for joining us. I sure appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all here as we discuss this very important ballot measure. I work with farmers and food processors here in Oregon, and I'm a part of the No on 92 Coalition because this measure really would hurt small family farmers, increase food costs, and it conflicts with national food labeling standards. Ballot Measure 92 is so badly written that it will not tell consumers what's in their foods. It will exempt 2/3 of the food that we eat, and it does not tell us what ingredients have been genetically engineered and for what trade. Oregon represents less than 1% of the U.S. food market, and this type of law would limit the ability of small food producers to sell their product in Oregon. And finally, the free market already has mechanisms to identify foods that do not contain genetically engineered ingredients. And that's through the USDA Organic Program and the Non-GMO Project. These are tried and tested programs that give the consumers the information they need. So once again, thank you for joining us tonight, and I urge you all in joining us to vote no on ballot measure 92. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Again, you've joined us for a telephone town hall on Measure 92. We know there's a lot of facts out there, and you're deciding how to vote. If you have a question for tonight, you can press 0 at any time to be connected and be put in line to ask your question. Now I want to introduce the last member of our panel tonight. It's Dana Bieber. She's an advocate for the No 192 Coalition, which represents Oregon farmers, ranchers, consumers, businesses, and taxpayers from across the state. Dana studied public policy impacts of mandatory single-state labeling proposals such as Measure 92. Dana?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and appreciate the opportunity that you're going to spend some time with us to discuss Measure 92. You know, as you heard Ian and Kevin talk about, the misleading labels, that it actually fails on its fundamental promise to provide accurate information to consumers about whether their food contains GMO ingredients, and that's the underlying problem with Measure 92. But while you won't get good and reliable information about ingredients in your food, what you will get under Measure 92 is increased costs both at the grocery store and on tax day. And let me explain what I mean by that. Measure 92, studies have been done on proposals such as this, and they have indicated that the cost of groceries will go up for single-state labeling policies like Measure 92 by hundreds of dollars a year for the average family of four. It's about $400 a year. And that's because of the segregation costs and the identity preservation costs that you heard Ian and Kevin mention. Those are costs that are borne by Oregon consumers. At the same time, Measure 92 is costly to Oregon taxpayers. It requires that it has to be enforced around thousands of farms in the state and tens of thousands of products in thousands of stores across the state. And in fact, the Department of Administrative Services has estimated that state taxpayers will have to pay $14 million every budget cycle in order to enforce Measure 92. And there's no funding source identified, or there's not even a limit of taxpayer money that can be spent on this. So it's a misleading labeling proposal that is all costs and no benefits. And that's why we've joined together in this coalition, and we welcome talking to you tonight and answering any questions you may have. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Dana. And again, if you have a question of your own, you can press 0 on your phone to ask it. Now we're going to go to our first question tonight. Our first question is from Emma in Portland. Emma?
Hello.
I'm sorry, is this Mike? Mike, do you have a question?
Yes, it is. Well, does anyone know how long they tested the GMOs before they were thrust on the public?
That's a good question, Mike. One thing that's misleading is even just the term GMO. So we've been modifying food for forever, so for centuries. So virtually every product that farmers like myself grow, every product that growers, or rather consumers in the grocery store buy, has been genetically modified at some point. Genetic modification is really just a progression, and over time the technology has gotten better and better. So what we're talking about labeling now is essentially just a more specific, more precise, more controlled way to genetically modified. So to answer your question, I think the first answer is that GMOs have been tested and have been in the food supply, safely in the food supply for centuries. The most recent technology has been in the food supply for decades, and there's been literally billions of meals eaten since it was first commercially grown. And even prior to that, it was very rigorously tested. And this isn't something that just enters the marketplace. 3 different federal agencies are tasked with regulating GMO crops before they're ever grown on any sort of commercial scale, and certainly before they enter the food supply. So to answer your question, the short answer is they're the most tested, most rigorously regulated and tested products in food history.
Great, thank you. And we're going to try and go to Emma this time. Emma, are you with us?
Thank you. My concern is the BT insecticide that is put into the crops through this genetic modification. How do you assure us that the food is safe if we eat it? Because that's why I want everything labeled that contains this BT so we can choose intelligently.
No, that's a great question, Emma, and it really offers a great opportunity to to correct a lot of misunderstanding about GMOs and about what BT is. So BT is actually just a naturally occurring protein that helps control pests. It is in some plants naturally. It's used in organic production. And when it is incorporated in GMOs, it's not, as some people think, a pesticide that's sprayed. It's something that's naturally being expressed in the plant, just like other plants express it naturally. And so it's not something that is in any way harmful. It has no impact whatsoever on human or animal consumption. It only targets insects, and the protein essentially makes the insects that attack the plants self-destruct. And the biggest or the shortest answer to that question is that BT has been around a long time, and it's used in organic production as well as conventional, and now in GMO production.
Thanks, Emma. Now we're going to go to Ruth in Hillsborough. Ruth, do you have a question?
I understand that no other state has this labeling measure or on the ballot or has it already. Do the proponents of this measure think that the people the voters of Oregon are uninformed and that we don't know how much more it's going to cost everybody?
Hey, Ruth, this is Dana. I'd be happy to answer your question. Clearly, you've done your homework because you've got your facts right about this. There is no other state that has a law like Measure 92. And in fact, something you alluded to, this is something that Oregon voters have actually rejected already. It was before voters about a dozen years ago, and Oregon voters said no. And the same group took this and they shopped it over to California 2 years ago and then to Washington last year. Washington and California voters both rejected a nearly identical measure, and for the same exact reasons, because it is so poorly written, it won't tell you what's in your food, but it will increase the cost of groceries, because what it really requires is that you'll have to segregate your food everywhere from the farm to the food producer to the distribution warehouse. Everything has to be specially handled, specially segregated, or it has to be specially remade just for the state of Oregon. That's where the real costs come in, and so that's why we just think it's just a flawed measure. It deserved a no vote last time Oregon voters shot it down, and it deserves a no vote again.
Thank you, Emma. And now we actually have a question from Kelly in Salem. Had to drop off the line, but he wanted to ask, how much will this cost for consumers? Ian, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I think that's a great question. There's a recent Cornell University study that puts at a minimum of $400 per the average family of four each year. And let's talk about where that cost comes from. It comes from two options a food processor has. They can either label the food product that contains genetically engineered, and what that means is they're going to have to get the product from the farm to the processing plant, and during that whole time, the food would have to be transported separately. It will have to be segregated in the processing line. There will have to be paperwork. There will have to be a sworn statement, and each of these steps would add a cost. And also, a labeling, whatever label it is, just labels in general have a negative connotation to it. So what we've seen is that most food processors don't want to label it. So their second option is to not use genetically engineered material. And that, of course, so non-GE sugar or corn, and that's more expensive. So either option that is left to a food processor will raise the price of food in the end. And I think this is what's so troubling. There's already options out there in the free market that tells consumers if it's been genetically engineered or not. And that's through USDA Organic and the Non-GMO Project. And for those consumers that wish to purchase that, it's a premium product. They pay for it. Now this is really forcing everybody else into that same system and forcing them to pay that extra cost when many people may not care if it contains genetically engineered material. So in the end, it really takes away consumer choice. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, if you're just joining tonight's telephone town hall, we really want to make this an interactive experience and hear from you. You can press 0 at any time to ask a question. Now we're going to go to a question from Klein in Lake Oswego. Klein?
Hi, I'd like to know, can we assume that if a product is not labeled non-GMO, that it actually is GMO?
Hey, Klein, this is Dana. I'd be happy to answer that question. That's a good one. You know, about 70% of the food that's sold in a grocery store may contain or made with GMO ingredients. So these are the foods, you know, that we've been eating for 20 years now, in fact. We've been serving on our family dinner table. So they've been a part of our culture for all that time. But the way the labeling will go under the labeling that you mentioned about the non-GMO label, there's two labels. There's the organic and non-GMO. Now, both of those labeling standards are nationwide labeling standards. Those are accurate and reliable. If you see those labels on a product, you can know that they were not made with any GMO products. So we have that label. Measure 92 actually conflicts with those labels because it has different special exemptions in it that aren't contained in those two labeling requirements. That's where you run into real problems with Measure 92 because the way that this is written, you'd have to look at a product and the absence of a label is supposed to imply that there's no GMO in it. But that's actually where it fails because you don't know if there's no label on a product, you don't know if that means, well, is there no GMO in it or did it just happen to get a special exemption? And that's what consumers wouldn't know. That's where it ends up misleading, and it's why we believe it deserves a no vote.
And you know, I'll just add, there's a standard that's been in the food stream where, like, if I want to go in and I want to buy a soda that doesn't have any calories in it, I don't buy, cola with calories. I buy Diet Cola, and that's the way that the food industry has operated for 100 years. And this measure really changes that into now you're labeling something that has something in it, which goes against the standard that we've all been operating under, and that is reliable.
Great. Now we're going to go to our next question. This is actually our first poll question of the night, and this is a chance for everyone who's listening to take part. And we're going to ask you, what actions are you willing to take to protect Oregon farmers? Press 1 if you'll encourage your friends and families to vote no. Press 2 if you'll write a letter to the editor about voting no on Measure 92. Press 3 if you'll share information on Facebook or Twitter about why you should vote no on Measure 92. Press 4 if you do all of the above. And of course, you can press 0 at any time if you have a question. Again, I'll just run through those options. What actions are you willing to take to protect Oregon farmers? Press 1 if you'll encourage your friends and family to vote no on Measure 92. Press 2 if you'll write a letter to the editor about voting no on Measure 92. Press 3 if you'll share information on Facebook or Twitter about why we should vote no on Measure 92. Press 4 if you'll do all the above. And again, if you have a question at any time, you can press 0. Now we want to go to Emily in Lake Oswego. Emily, I believe you have a question for us.
Hi, this is Alice. My question is this. On a couple of the materials that I've read and on some of the ads, I'm hearing something very similar to this, and I hope I'm remembering it correctly, that, of course, this is going to cost more. It's going to be more difficult for our Oregon farmers to satisfy the guidelines if this passes. And it's going to be far stricter than the rest of the United States. So does that say to me that the rest of the U.S. has guidelines already and we do not, or am I hearing that incorrectly? I guess I'm just wondering, are there uniform guidelines throughout the rest of the United States, and Oregon does not have any guidelines on GMOs?
That's a good question, Emily. So there are, of course, across the U.S., FDA regulates labeling, and there's truth in labeling requirements, and Ian can probably expand on that much more than I know. In countries all around the world and in the U.S., it's usually the case that labels are regulated at the federal level, and FDA does have guidelines for voluntary labeling of GMO. And as Ian mentioned, there's really good voluntary schemes out there, one being USDA's National Organic Standard and the other being the Non-GMO Project. And so the reason why this would be so much more costly for Oregon farmers and food processors and eventually for consumers is because it is unilateral. This is a standard that would only apply in Oregon and would require farmers to really dramatically increase the stewardship requirements, additional labor, additional equipment expenses. In some cases, it may require a whole new fleet of equipment to harvest and transport a crop in order to maintain segregation and the integrity of a crop. And then in order to maintain that segregation, it could also be the case that you have to plant buffer strips or separate production to have a bit of space between non-GMO or GMO, which could really change your crop rotation and reduce the profitability of cultivation on your farm. And so that's where a lot of the direct costs come in, and then not to mention all of the record keeping and the legal risk that also might apply. And from a farmer's perspective, that's where the costs come in. But of course, it escalates up the food chain as well.
Yeah, and I think what's really troubling, if this were to pass, we would be the only state out of 49 states that would have this. There would be no other labeling requirement like this, not only in the United States, but in the entire world. We would have our own little set of standards that our farmers would have to abide by, but other farmers don't. Idaho farmers wouldn't have to. California wouldn't have to. Washington wouldn't have to. And these are farmers' direct competitors. So that's why it's so problematic. We would be the only one. Right now, we're the same. But if this were to pass, it would change. So it's very troublesome.
Thanks. And again, if you have a question at any time, you can press 0 to ask your question. Now we're going to go to Casey in Portland. I understand you have some questions about some TV that has been on, ads that have been on the air.
Howdy. Yeah, no, I'm kind of teetering. I'm actually sitting here with my wife and daughter, so this is a good discussion for us. But we've all watched and saw the commercial with the engineer that is holding the corn that's got the GMO and the non-corn or the non-GMO corn, and him talking about these are the same people that made Agent Orange, DDT, said it was safe. That in itself is a scary thought. Granted, we have been eating that type of corn for who knows how long, but I think knowing about it is important. What is different from what I've heard so far? It sounds like on a national level that this is more of a voluntary disclosure that it is GMO and not a mandated process, and whereas Oregon is asking that to be mandated. So help me understand this.
No, that's Casey. I've seen the ad, and I'm sure a lot of the folks here on the call have also seen the ad. So thanks for bringing that up. It's a good opportunity to correct some misconceptions. It's really disappointing to see that ad. It's incredibly deceptive, and it's really, I think, a shameful scare tactic on the part of the proponents of Measure 92. First of all, the reason why FDA has chosen to, at this point, make it a voluntary standard at the federal level is because there's no characteristics in GMOs that would pose any health or safety risks for consumption. So it's a standard that's based on science and on the proven health and safety of GMOs. So that's the reason why it's voluntary versus mandatory. And as for the ad, the blue corn that shows up that's supposedly covered in pesticides and chemicals, it's just simply false and deceptive. First of all, GMO is not dyed blue. Any corn can be dyed. It's often dyed for identification, or sometimes it's treated in both organic, conventional, and GMO production in order to preserve it in some cases, or in order to reduce fungus or pest damage or anything like that. So it's not by any means something that is a characteristic of GMO. And it's also the case that GMOs just simply don't have higher pesticide or chemical residue we grow some G crops here on our farm, and it's actually the case that the crops that we grow, we use fewer chemicals, fewer herbicides on those crops, and the herbicides that we do use are less harmful both for the environment and more benign for human, and doesn't pose any more risk, or in some cases is far less risk than conventional or some organic pesticides that are used in organic production. So thanks for bringing that up. It's really a shameful scare tactic on the parts of the proponents, and it's unfortunate that it's out there, and I hope that consumers can get the facts before they have a chance to vote.
Thanks for that question. And again, if you have a question of your own, you can press 0 to ask at any time. We're now going to go to Robert in Salem. Robert, do you have a question for us?
Hello.
Hey, Robert, go ahead.
Yes. I understand there are two sides to every story, and the farmers are going to pay, and so are we, if this measure passes. But what I want to know, what does the other side winning in putting this measure on the ballot in the first place? Who are they, and how do they gain?
Hey, Robert, this is a terrific question, and I'd be happy to answer it. This is Dana. This is the same failed recycled measure that this same out-of-state group has been shopping around to states all over the western part of the United States for years. In fact, this whole thing started, believe it or not, in Oregon, but Oregon voters rejected this years ago. And so the same outside group took it to California and then to Washington. Both those states rejected it, and we're right back here in Oregon again. It is this same group of folks. It's the Dr. Bronner's Magic Soap. I swear to you, I'm not making up that name. It's a group from California. It's also this company called Mercola. It's this discredited doctor who runs a company out of Illinois selling supplements. He's the same guy who opposes childhood vaccines and doesn't believe in cancer treatments and urges women to not get mammograms. So that's what we're up against there. It's also the Organic Consumers Fund. They've been very clear that what they're trying to do, their motive for doing this, is that they want to increase the market share of organic products, and they have been very clear and very vocal and gone on the record that the way they think that they can increase their market share is by getting these labeling laws passed in other states. So that's their financial interest in doing that. And you know what? Shame on them for that, because what it ends up hurting is Oregon consumers and Oregon family farmers. And that's why this coalition of 33,000 people have come together to urge a no vote and to not let these companies take over here in Oregon like they want to. And that we want to protect consumers and keep grocery prices affordable, not have these two new state bureaucracies created under Measure 92. And we want to protect family farmers like Kevin and food producers like Ian. And that's why our coalition is together. So great question, and thanks so much for spending some time with us tonight so we can answer that.
Thanks again. And again, our opportunity tonight is to answer your questions, clear up the facts around the measure. You can also go to the website factson92.com or voteno on92.com to join our coalition. And, of course, you could ask a question of your own by pressing 0. We now want to go to Shelley in Corvallis. Shelley, go ahead. Shelley, you still with us? Oh, we lost Shelley. Let's go to Leonard in Portland. I understand he wants to talk a little bit about pricing. Leonard? Leonard, are you still there?
Hi.
Leonard. Hey, Leonard.
Can you hear me?
We're good. Go ahead.
Okay. I know the ads keep talking about, like in Europe, all Europe did it and the prices didn't go up. And then we hear here that the prices are going to go up. And then we hear that the proponents are saying that the prices won't go up. Can you define exactly where the prices are going to go up?
I'd
That's a
be
good
happy
question,
to answer.
Leonard. I think I'll start off, and then I think Ian probably has a lot more information than I do. First of all, I don't think it's true at all that prices haven't gone up in jurisdictions where they have required labeling. Food pricing, consumer indexes in Europe are some of the highest in the world, and the same is true for Japan and other places that have required labeling, and some of those jurisdictions have required it for some time. And there's quite a bit of good evidence that it does raise prices. I think the simplest way to think about it, for me anyways, is, as Ian mentioned earlier, there are voluntary labeling schemes out there, one being the National Organic Standard and the other being the Non-GMO Project. And those are premium foods. Those are something that consumers pay more for. Some of that additional cost is the cost associated with non-GMO production. And from a farmer's perspective, that's higher stewardship costs, more labor, more equipment, and sometimes additional equipment just to maintain such a high standard of purity, maintain that segregation and that integrity of a crop for what is essentially an arbitrary distinction between commodity non-GMO and GMO. And then also just really changing what is a sustainable and good crop rotation, taking some land possibly out of production, changing the crops we grow, reducing the profitability overall on a farm. So those are some of the direct costs that farmers face, and those get passed right on to processors who purchase our products and eventually to consumers.
You know, this is Dana. I'll add something too, and I'm going to be very straightforward. The proponents are simply not telling the truth when it comes to the real cost of Measure 92. You know, they put together this cost memo recently where they talked about what the cost of it would be. They only looked at the cost of actually printing a label and adhering it to a package. And in fact, they instructed the authors of the study, and it says it in the very first page of the study, they instructed the authors to ignore the cost of segregation, which Kevin and Ian talked about, that 100 complete segregation just for foods in Oregon. They also told them to ignore the cost of ingredient substitution. Those are the real costs. That's where you get to the hundreds of dollars more per food per year for families. And most certainly, the cost of food in Europe did go up. There was a 2010 study that came from the EU that said not only did the cost of food go up, consumer choice went down because food companies weren't going to necessarily remake their food with those higher priced ingredients, and so there was less choices for consumers as well. So make no mistake, this is going to be a costly measure.
And if you have a question of your own, again, remember, press 0 to ask at any time. Now we're going to go to Edward, and I understand Edward has spent some time looking at the measure and wanted to talk about it. Edward?
Yes, good evening. I had the privilege of serving on the Citizens Initiative Review Committee for this particular measure. So we spent 4 days doing a significant amount of research and listening to testimony on both sides of the issue, and ultimately voted to recommend a no vote on the measure. One of the largest concerns I had, which I haven't heard addressed tonight, maybe it was before I got on the line, had to do with the potential for lawsuits against farmers and package companies and anybody who produced or delivered the product. It seems to me like it's almost an open-ended opportunity to file lawsuit after lawsuit against anyone who's involved in the chain of bringing food to us, and that troubles me a lot.
Edward, first of all, this is Dana. Thanks so much for serving on the Citizens Initiative Review Panel. I recognize that was a 4-day commitment, long days where you heard from experts on both sides of the issues. You poured through a mountain of materials reading on this. So thanks so much for your service on that and your leadership, because you're right, the Citizens Initiative Review Panel urged a no vote. And so let's go to the lawsuit provision that you're talking about. This is one of the reasons, and you heard Kevin mention it earlier, this is why it's of real concern to family farmers. And what's interesting about it, and particularly troubling, is that it's the small family farmers who are really held out to this new level of liability. Because what it says is at any farmer, if that farmer sells any products, for example, at a roadside stand or at a farmer's market, or they have a product such as a food product. They make their own jams or jellies, for example, which is a growing market here in Oregon. Any of those farmers who sell their product are exposed to this enormous level of liability. And what it means for them is there can be fines that can be brought about them for $10,000 a day fines. And they're also responsible for paying attorney's fees for the plaintiff who brings the lawsuit. In fact, it's actually written so onerous for farmers, there's actually criminal penalties available under this as well. So the lawsuit provision is something that's got the small family farmers of great concern, and that's why they've joined the coalition and are urging a no vote.
Thanks, Edward. And now we want to go to our second poll question of the night. This is a chance for everyone to weigh in. People in Oregon have now received their ballots. When do you plan to fill out your ballot to vote no on 92 and send it in? Press 1 if you fill it in and you fill it out and send it in this week. Press 2 if you'll send it in next week, or press 3 if you've already got it in. Again, people in Oregon have already received their ballots. When do you plan to fill out your ballot to vote no on 92 and send it in? Press 1 if you fill it out and send it in this week. Press 2 if you'll send it in next week, or press 3 if you've already sent it in. And of course, if you have a question of your own, you can ask it by pressing 0. Now we want to go to Kathy in Lake Oswego. Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think my question was already answered. It was regarding what Europeans are doing, which is I know several people who live in Italy and France and who love their food, and they do not want genetically modified food. It's a big deal to them, and I heard the speaker say that food prices have gone up there. But what are they basing their decisions on in general in Europe? It sounds like it's more widespread than in other words, more widespread in the sense that people do not want genetically modified food in Europe. But is that true?
You know, this is Dana. I'd be happy to answer that question. You know, actually, scientific and government leaders all throughout the EU have been urging the EU to reverse their stance on these labeling requirements. So you're seeing a movement that's changing back the other way. And there's for a variety of reasons. I mean, they're turning their back on the technologies that Kevin has been talking about that allow farmers to get greater yields from their land using less water, less herbicides, and using their farm equipment less. So, you know, they want to implement those kind of farming practices, and also just because of the cost of food. The cost of food is higher there in Europe, and it stems from the fact that you have to use higher priced non-GMO ingredients, and which is what's happened in Europe, rather than placing that inaccurate and misleading label on it. So that's where the cost has come in Europe. There's a 2010 study that backs up that not only are the costs greater, but the choices are fewer in Europe. So, you know, don't let the proponents fool you that they have no data whatsoever. We have a study from the EU that says that is the case. So that's the situation in Europe, and that's why, and that's even talking about an entire country where Measure 92 is 1/50th of a country. You can see where you really run into problems.
Yeah, and I would just like to add, you know, there's actually several countries in Europe that grow genetically engineered. It's a misnomer, Spain being the largest one. There are many test plots throughout Europe. You know, anyone can, there's a really good study that the European Union put out, and like Dana alluded to, they are looking at, because, you know, their land is not growing, but their population are, and the only way they could meet the need without importing large amount of food is having new technology that genetically engineering offers them. So there is a huge rethink going on in Europe right now, and you know, unfortunately, I think you know, politics can sometimes get in the way of good public policy. But over time, I think truth will win out, and Europe will even become more friendly to GE than it already is. Thank you.
Thanks. And again, if you have any questions about the measure, you can go to factson92.com. Now we're going to go to Dave and Bend, who wants to know about the difference between this and other measures that have been proposed in other states. Dave?
Yeah, good evening. My question, I'd like to know what the difference is between the Oregon Initiative and the initiatives in Vermont, Connecticut, and Maine that have already passed.
Hey, Dave, this is Dana. I'd be happy to answer that question for you. So you mentioned the other states. I should point out, though, however, Maine and Connecticut, although their state legislatures did pass a law, they actually don't go into effect until at least 4 other neighboring states pass an identical law. So, I mean, let's be honest, they're not worth the paper that they're written on, because that's not going to happen. Vermont, however, they do their legislature did pass a law. But the problem with that is it actually conflicts with Measure 92. Vermont has a different tolerance level of, Measure 92 has a zero tolerance level, and the Vermont law has a variance of 0.9%. Also, there's different exemptions that are allowed under the Vermont law and under the Measure 92 law. The label itself has to be different in the two states. So you can see where we already run into problems with a labeling system like this when you take it state by state. And that's the fundamental problem, is that you don't want to have a patchwork quilt where there's a labeling requirement in Washington that is different than Oregon, which is entirely different than Idaho. It's one of the many reasons that labeling standards are set at the federal level. That way, every farmer and every food producer and every consumer are treated equally, and that's the way it should be. And that's the way we get uniformity and we get everybody treated equally and fairly. And that's why Measure 92, it fails not just the farmers and the food producers like you're hearing from Ian and Kevin, but it's the consumers as well who get the inaccurate and misleading information. So that's why we urge a no vote.
Thank you. And again, if you have any questions about 92, you can press 0 now, or you can go to factson92.com. I can see that we're coming to the end of our town hall here, and wanted to give everyone a chance to say a few concluding thoughts. Ian, do you want to start?
Yes, I will. Thanks for spending some time with us tonight. This is a very, very important measure that has significant ramifications on Oregon's farmers, Oregon's food producers, small businesses, and we need everyone to join us and to vote no. And the end result will be Oregon will have a go-it-alone strategy when it comes to this. No other country, no other state will have something similar to ballot measure 92. We will have they'll be unable to compete globally and nationwide around the country. And that's something I'd like to hit on. The language of the measure, it says produce with genetically engineered food. What does that really tell the consumer? It doesn't tell what kind of ingredients that was engineered, what percentage. And these are the sort of things that are actually in Europe. And that's why we say it'll be like no other standard that is out there. Very, very dangerous. So please, I ask you all to join us and vote no. Thank you.
Great. And before I turn it over to Kevin, I wanted to give us one last question. Virginia in Beaverton had a question. Virginia, you want to go ahead?
My question was, with so many people having illnesses like diabetes and things, those labels are very important that we can be able to read it. Are they going to be putting the words in college language, or is it going to be down to earth where people can understand what they're purchasing?
Hey, Virginia, this is Dana. I'd be happy to answer that question. What the Measure 92 requires is that it would state on the product that it was genetically engineered. One of the problems with it, though, that doesn't really tell you much, does it? So you would look at a product and you wouldn't even know which ingredient is GMO and how much is GMO. And in fact, because it does require the labeling of some products that even don't contain a GMO content, even if they came from a GE plant, but there was no GMO in the food, absolutely zero, it still has to have a label on it. So that's where the information, I think, really fails consumers. Unlike, current labeling. If you look on a back of a package and you want to know how much sugar is on there, it tells you exactly how many grams and what percentage of the daily allowance of sugar that contains. That's accurate and reliable and real information. This doesn't provide that same kind of information. It just says genetically engineered, so no idea of which ingredients and how much. And it's one of the reasons it provides misleading information. So it's one of the reasons we think it deserves a no vote.
Thanks, Dana. And now we're going to finish wrapping up. Kevin, do you want to give us your last thoughts on the measure?
Sure, yeah. No, I just really appreciate the opportunity to join the call tonight and answer a few questions from a farmer's perspective and hopefully get some facts out there and possibly correct some misconceptions about what GMOs are and about crop production and about the cost that Measure 92 would impose on farmers in Oregon. as a young family farmer, I'm really concerned about the future of my business, the future of my livelihood, and I think that Measure 92 is possibly one of the most most negative, most dangerous policy proposals that we've seen recently. Something that would really not just harm us in the immediate term with some direct costs, but also put us at a real competitive disadvantage in the long term, and really discourage research and innovation in crops and new technology that has the potential to improve farming, improve productivity, efficiency, and sustainability of farming here in Oregon. And I think that those costs are the things that worry me the most, and I think will have a real negative impact on the future of farming in Oregon. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I urge you to join us in voting no on 92.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this evening and taking time out of your evening to talk about this important measure. You've heard us talk about the 2/3 of the food that's exempt, and that includes thousands of food products that have GMO in it but get a special exemption. And yet there are still already existing nationwide labeling standards for consumers who are looking for non-GMO foods. And we talked a lot about the costs associated, not just at the grocery store, but also for taxpayers as well. And of course, Kevin and Ian talked about the farmer and food processor costs. But it's not just us saying this. It's not just our campaign. There have been 12 independent papers from around the state who heard from both the yes side and the no side, and oftentimes in the same room at the same time. And 12 of those newspapers have come out urging a no vote on Measure 92. We've had papers say everything from the fact that the essential problem is dishonesty. Newspapers who have quoted, the Gazette said that it provides misleading information to consumers. So there's a reason that these papers say no. It's the same reason that the Citizens Initiative Review Panel urged a no vote. It provides inaccurate, misleading information, and it increases the cost of food for all. So thank you again for spending some time with us this evening. We really appreciate it. Most importantly, we ask that you would vote, and you vote, by Halloween and get your ballot mailed in. It's critical. It's a close election, and we really need you and your family and your friends to vote no on Measure 92. Thanks again. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Dina. And thanks, Ian and Kevin, for taking the time to join us on the panel tonight. We know there's a lot of information out there, and you want to have an informed vote, so we appreciate you taking the time to listen in. We also encourage you to go to factson92.com. And when you're ready, stand up and join our coalition. Vote no on 92.com. Ballots are due by November 4th. It's really important for informed voters like yourself to make sure that their voices are heard in this election. Make sure to get those ballots in by November 4th. Thanks so much for listening in. Good night.